The wrestling business is a business. Now look, I know that seems rather obvious, but somehow this bears repeating because there are many fans out there that just don't seem to get this. As the internet is just filled with people who can't stop complaining about all the decisions WWE makes, even though if you just stop to remember that they have a monetary motive for most of their actions, it all of a sudden becomes quite clear the kind of things that they're going to do. But alas, some people just can't handle that. And that's exactly why the topic of this episode is all about getting those fans caught up with the program so they can catch up to the rest of us. Because today, thank you to all the wonderful supporters out there who support me over on Patreon, like True Sinister and The Reflection of Perfection. To find out how to get your own Patreon shoutout, please go over and check out my Patreon page. Alright, so allow me to start by saying that this doesn't mean that you have to agree with every single creative booking decision that you see on TV, or that you even have to like any of them, or doesn't mean that you have to do the exact same things if you were put in the same position. And I'll be one of the first ones to agree that not everything in this world should be done with money in mind. And in reality, all of us would be much better off if we weren't driven by our finances. And so, don't think that I'm here to justify business. But I am trying to say that sometimes the business aspect of, well, the business isn't always necessarily a bad thing, and sometimes it's just the reality of the situation. And we should do our best to keep that in mind for these certain scenarios. What kind of scenarios? Well, let's just get into it. Alright, so it's best to just rip this band-aid off right away, but the reality is, monetarily speaking, fans don't mean as much to the industry as we think we do. Don't get me wrong, our dollars do mean a lot, and wrestling companies do want them, but when you look at the money derived from things like ticket sales and merchandise, it pales in comparison to a lot of other revenue sources. For example, as of this recording, WWE is worth $7.56 billion, and this is after the $9.5 billion that they already sold for. Plus, let's remember that Saudi Arabia, Fox, and the Peacock all gave WWE $1 billion each, and that was just for deals that would take place over the next several years. Therefore, while WWE does make millions and millions off of its fans, they tend to generate a lot more money from other sources. Furthermore, when you look at things like how well WWE is doing in the stock market, or their television ratings from last year till now, or their attendance figures from last year till now, you notice that things really aren't all that different, or in the case of the stock market, they're actually doing way better. And the point I'm trying to make here is no matter how angry you are at the ongoing run of Roman Reigns, just realize that the decision to make Roman win over Cody Rhodes, Sami Zayn, or Drew McIntyre hasn't really affected WWE financially. And so when you're dealing with the masses and looking at the bigger picture, why would WWE placate to the IWC when clearly everything is going just fine? And yes, theoretically, fan engagement is part of the consideration that these companies made for making these deals with WWE. But when you stop to look at it, it's really hard to come up with any hard proof that that's necessarily the case. As I mentioned previously, Last Man Standing, the show that was on Fox at 8 o'clock on Friday nights before SmackDown came in, debuted on the network with over 8 million viewers. SmackDown, on the other hand, didn't debut anywhere near that, and it would take about a month's worth of episodes to total that back when it was on the USA Network. Thus, even though it had lower ratings than the show it replaced, and even though SmackDown had lower ratings than it did during the Attitude Era, Fox still forked over $1 billion anyway. So as nice as things like television ratings and social media scores and ticket sales and merchandise are, and while they might influence a lot of choices within WWE, my overall point is that fan interaction and fan satisfaction don't seem to play the primary role in WWE's revenue stream, as they tend to make a lot more money by pleasing CEOs instead of their own fan base. But don't think that this is just a WWE problem, as this does affect everybody from AEW all the way down to your local indie fed. For example, let's say you are running a small local independent wrestling promotion, and your upcoming show is going to be one of the swankier independent wrestling shows, as you're going to charge a whole $25 per ticket. Now let's just figure that this is a standard 10-match card. That would mean a minimum of at least 20 wrestlers, not including battle royals, triple threats, or tag matches. And while some of the lower talents on the show might be perfectly happy getting paid with a hot dog and a handshake, the higher talents are going to want, you know, actual money. And so, averaging everything out, let's just say it costs you roughly $50 per talent, which is a fairly realistic number. Well, 20 wrestlers times $50 equals $1,000. but we're also having to take into consideration the cost of the venue, which for a VFW might cost you around $500, which is pretty standard. And we also have to think about renting the ring, which again will be about another $500 as well. And so just by renting the venue, renting the ring, and paying the wrestlers, we're already at $2,000. Meanwhile, if we're charging $25 per ticket and we happen to get 50 people in-house, which is good for an independent show. I mean, I've been to Chikara shows that only had about 35 people in attendance. Well, that would equal only $1,250, which is nowhere near enough. And also, this is not factoring in a lot of other things, such as paying the bookers or the announcers or anybody else who's working behind the scenes. And so, from this rather plausible illustration, you can see that it takes a lot for professional wrestling companies to make ends meet, which is why even in the case of a lot of indie feds, they rely on income coming from a lot of different places, such as sponsorship deals or revenue coming from distribution online or merchandise sales. But speaking of which, going back to what I was talking about earlier, I'm not trying to say that merchandise sales don't mean anything to a company, even WWE. As money is still money, I'm just trying to say that if you're an independent promotion, merchandise sales probably makes a bigger percentage of your income than it does for a big publicly traded company like WWE. And so, despite not being the biggest blip on the radar, things like merchandise sales do matter internally, as merchandise is typically one of the better ways to gauge who actively is drawing, because here we see that consumers are buying merchandise specifically designed around one particular wrestler. And when you know who your top earners are, it just makes sense that you're going to put them in positions where they can continue to make even more money for you. Now again, this isn't an end-all be-all, but it is just something interesting of note. Because the truth is, business is rather complicated, and there are many—
I thought you said the stock market was why people do everything.
People do things for more than one reason, and a lot of people out there can handle multifaceted ideas. It's not all—
Inconceivable. Vince McMahon does things for one reason and only one reason.
That's not true at all. And the reality is—
What? It's like you don't even know Vince McMahon.
You don't know him either. Anyway, for those of you who understand that even though it may not be the most powerful metric, merchandise sales do still play a factor. For example, going into this year's WrestleMania, Cody Rhodes and Roman Reigns both got to compete for the title in the main event. However, about 2 months prior, it was announced that Roman Reigns was the top merchandise seller in the company, while Cody Rhodes, on the other hand, was number 2. And wouldn't you know, lo and behold, it was the Tribal Chief that walked out of WrestleMania still champion. But let's look at the WrestleMania the year prior. Let's look at WrestleMania 38. And while that did take place in 2022, let's look at the top merchandise seller for the year before, because that was Stone Cold Steve Austin, who topped the list over all other talents, all other full-timers, and despite being retired for 19 years. And while he didn't win the title at WrestleMania, let's remember he is almost 60 years old, he did get to main event night 1 and collect a win over Kevin Owens. But what about 2021's highest merchandise seller who was a full-time wrestler? Well, believe it or not, that would go to Alexa Bliss. And while fans didn't particularly care for it and a lot of people were over it, they sure kept Alexa's gimmick going even after The Fiend. But now, looking at all this, it can be downright maddening. Can we just enjoy professional wrestling? Can we just like it? Well, yeah, we can. The truth of the matter is, you don't have to be that type of fan. You can just watch the product without having to get involved in the wheelings and dealings of the inner workings of the business. Which, believe it or not, is what most wrestling fans actually do. We just don't realize this because they're not that vocal about it online. Because casual fans tend not to waste their time by going onto the internet to talk about wrestling in depth. Now sure, I do it myself and I also do work in the wrestling industry, but that may not necessarily be for everybody, as admittedly there can be a lot of mental thorns that come with this rose. But as far as I'm concerned, if you're really gonna play armchair booker and you want to go inside baseball, then it's only logical that you have to also embrace all of the things that upper management of a professional wrestling promotion have to endure, which sometimes mean putting aside who your favorite wrestler is and who you would book to be the champion, and instead remembering your fiduciary responsibilities to your shareholders, keeping in mind that you also have to work with your network instead of against it. And so just just to be clear, you don't have to be the kind of fan that cares about WWE's bottom line. But if you do become a more business-minded fan, well, it tends to alleviate some of the geek rage fire that you have over a lot of WWE's booking decisions, as their choices seem less baffling when you realize, oh yeah, that's right, they just want to make money. And of course, you still don't have to like it, you just get to shrug it off a little easier when you know that's what they're all about. But yet, another benefit is that whenever WWE does make a boneheaded business move, which they still do from time to time, you get to laugh at them a whole lot harder than you would have beforehand. Well, there you go, an overview of some of the facets of looking at the professional wrestling business as a business. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and make sure that you're subscribed to the Thinking Fans channel. And I also want to give a big thank you to all my awesome Patreon supporters out there, and I also want to thank you for watching. And as always, Dave knows.